So just today is a talk on managing negative emotions, but just to kind of put forward at the beginning that this talk is not designed to help you guys address serious emotional or behavioral issues. So things like clinical levels of anxiety or depression or mental illness. So just in case that's why you're here, if you do feel you might need support around those issues, there's some contact numbers for some very good services there and a very good professional in Dr. Sean O'Connell, or feel free to get in touch with me and I can point you in the right direction if that's what you need and what you're after. But it's not what we're covering today. So I want to begin by, I'd like to talk a little bit about the idea of meaning and emotion. So what I want you guys to do, I would like you to let me know in the chat box what you feel or what you might feel when I'm going to describe an event, and I just want you to put in what you might feel in the different stages. So I'll prompt you when I want you to stick in the chat box. So first off, I want you to imagine you're sitting at home of an evening. Maybe you're watching your favorite show on Netflix, and suddenly there's a knock on the door. You're not expecting anybody, but you answer the door, and there's a very, very handsome man, piercing blue eyes. And obviously this will differ on your sexual orientation, etc. But maybe just let me know in the chat box, how might you feel? What emotion might you feel? You open the door and there's a very handsome man there. You're not expecting the call, but curious. Okay, Eileen, very good. Curious, there's a lot of curiosity. Nervous, okay. Intrigued, very good. Okay, so you take a second and you kind of gather yourself. And so you're feeling a bit curious, but also maybe a bit nervous. You kind of step back a little bit and you kind of take this person a little bit more, and suddenly you realize it's a guard. So maybe something's wrong, or why is there a guard at your door? Let me know in the chat box. How do you think you might feel now? Frightened, okay, Katie. Oh, sorry, a guardie. Sorry, somebody asked what a guard is. Excuse, I've got a bit of a cold today. Okay, so you're going to feel probably a lot of negative emotion I'm getting. So, okay, so, you suddenly realize it's a guard, you're kind of gathering yourself a bit more, but suddenly you look and suddenly the uniform, the guard, it's a little bit off. There's a little bit something not quite right with it. And suddenly you notice he's unbuttoning his top button and his next button. And you wonder, and suddenly you realize it's a stripper as opposed to a real guard. How might you feel now? Let me know in the chat box. Again, this will vary depending on the person, massively. Shocked, funny, incredulous, hilarious, awkward, threatening. Okay, so we've got quite a range of emotions here. And I suppose what I'm trying to get across here is that how we feel in a situation is very much dependent on the meaning that we attach to it. So the stimulus, the actual, I suppose, the guard, stripper in this instance, didn't actually change. But the meaning that you attach to it did, as your perspective or your perception of the situation kind of changed. So how does this link to our productivity? Well, we generally increase a behavior if we feel rewarded, and we reduce a behavior if we feel that it punishes us in some way or makes us feel bad emotion. So how do we decide what the reward and a punishment? Well, that's all about the meaning that we attach to a situation. So in the first instance, I suppose a lot of people were saying they felt curious, or I suppose it was a good thing. In the second, there was a lot of negative emotions generally, so that's kind of indicating that it's kind of punishment. And in the third instance, well, that was varied responses. Surprise, surprise. So I suppose my main point here is the meaning that we attach to a situation determines our emotion, and that's going to link to our productivity because our emotions very much link to our motivation. Okay. So I suppose before I go any further, I should introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. So my name is Jayson Moran, and I'm a psychologist who specializes in the psychology of performance and development and well-being. So really what I'm all about is helping people move forward. So I suppose I help people move forward. It's all about achieving their goals, and I do that by increasing their effectiveness. And I tend to help people increase their effectiveness by looking kind of three key areas. So the first is I help people increase their happiness and their well-being. And this is all about because we tend to perform better, we tend to be much more productive and effective when we're happier and when our well-being needs are being met. So we might look at questions like who you are, where you're at right now, and where is that in relation to the kind of things that might make you happy. So we might look at things like your personality or the balance between various aspects of your life, or maybe how you're performing in your career in various parts of your business or in your job, and how you'd like to improve there. The second area that I tend to help people in is all about the future, I suppose, and gaining clarity and getting organized. So it's about figuring out what it is that we want and how we're going to get there. So really, this is about setting goals, about asking questions about, where do you want to go and who do you want to be? So we might look at things like, are your goals structured in such a way that makes it more likely that you'll achieve them? Have you a plan in place that's going to work? Are you clear about what it is that you want? Is what you want in line with what's important? Is what you want in line with the person you are? So the third area that I tend to help people in, and this is much more relevant today, and this is about overcoming barriers to performance and productivity. So those barriers can be both psychological and practical in nature. So common practical barriers might be things like changing a behavior or making an important decision, or maybe you have a model in order to effectively solve problems. More psychological barriers then are things like stress, confidence, motivation, procrastination, and I suppose the topic of today's talk, which is about managing negative emotion. Okay, so just to let you know, I do one-to-one work, I do workshops, and I do development programs. You'll see a link in the chat if I suppose if any of those areas are areas you'd like to work on, I do a free consultation. I also run a meetup called Practical Psychology, so some of you guys might be here through that. But it's the meetup really organizes a lot of free talks similar to today and workshops, etc., etc. So if you want to join a meetup, again, there's a link in the chat there, just at the very beginning of the chat, there should be. And finally, our next event is the Procrastination Bootcamp on June 10th. So if you want to find out a little bit more about that, again, there should be a link in the chat at the moment. Okay. So back to managing negative emotions to boost your productivity. So today we're going to talk a little bit about negative emotions and what tends to cause them. We're going to have a little look at the cognitive behavioral method, and we're going to have a look at some unhelpful beliefs that we often have around our productivity. And then we're also going to look at some strategies, like what is it that we can do about this. Okay. So negative emotions and what causes them. Well, what I'm going to put forward is that I suppose what all negative emotions will have in common is that they're almost always based on a belief. So for example, we tend to feel anxiety or fear because we believe that the future is dangerous. So for example, maybe you're working on a project and you don't know whether you're going to get it done in time, or you don't know whether it's going to be a success. And so as a result, you might feel a little bit of anxiety or fear. We tend to feel anger or frustration when we're not making progress. So for example, if the internet isn't working and you're not able to, I suppose, maybe get your project over the line. Or we also tend to feel anger or frustration when we feel we've been attacked or something important to us is being attacked. So for example, maybe you're worried about someone is talking to you, talking behind your back or saying something. Shame and guilt are a little bit different. Shame, we tend to feel shame when we believe that we've publicly shown a defect or shown that we're not capable or not, I suppose, an effective human being to an extent. So for example, you might feel shame about a work project or something you're working on if you're worried it's not going to be good enough. Guilt is a little bit different. Guilt is then about if we feel that we've had a moral violation or lapses and we've done something wrong. So maybe, I suppose, in regards to your productivity, maybe that's about, maybe you feel you should have worked harder, or that you should be able to do the task, or you should feel more motivated. Hurt then is all about reaction to a perceived injustice. So we tend to feel hurt, which can often lead to frustration and anger when we feel that something is a little bit unfair. So I suppose a common narrative we tell ourselves when we're feeling hurt around productivity is that I shouldn't have to do this. So I won't go through all of these, but the main point is that almost all of these emotions are based on a belief that we tend to hold. Yeah. So this is the basis of what's called, and I suppose the main method I use when I'm working with clients to help them overcome negative emotions related to the productivity, is the cognitive behavioral model. And I suppose its basic premise is this, is that around any given situation, we have got three possible responses. We have emotions, we feel things, we have behaviors, we act, I suppose, and we've thoughts or beliefs, we think. Yeah. And what's interesting is that these emotions, these behaviors, these beliefs, all of these responses, they interact and affect each other. So for example, our emotions affect how we think and how we behave. So I don't know if you've ever been really, really angry with someone. Maybe you've thought some very terrible things about that person. Maybe you've even said some terrible things about that person. And then after the anger goes away, then suddenly you can't believe you thought those things or said those things. So how we feel can really affect how we think and how we behave. Conversely, how we behave can also affect how we feel and how we think. So I remember the first time I was ever speaking in public, and about halfway through it, I suddenly realized it was going okay. So I thought to myself, hey, this is going quite well. Maybe I can do this. And emotionally wise, I started to feel pride. So our behaviors, or how we act, can really affect how we feel and how we think. Now, a very important relationship in the cognitive behavioral model is this idea that our thoughts or our beliefs affect how we feel and how we behave, i.e. our emotions and our behaviors or our actions are a consequence of our thoughts or beliefs. So for example, a couple of years ago, I was working on my master's thesis, and it was a very difficult, horrible project. And I was having thoughts like, you know what, I don't want to do this. This is really hard. It shouldn't be this hard. And as a result, I was feeling negative emotions, things like frustration and anxiety and boredom. And as a result, I was procrastinating quite a lot. Now, I did a little bit of work on it, and then I suppose I changed my thoughts to things like, you know, this is really important. I need to get this done. What strategies can I use? What are the priorities? And I suppose by changing my thoughts around them, this in turn made me feel a little bit more optimistic, a little bit more determined. And as a result, I sat down and got to work. So this also explains why two people in the exact same situation can have very different emotional and behavioral responses. They will, I suppose, have different thoughts or beliefs around the situation. Okay. So what we often think it's this. We often think it's the environment. We often think what's going on to trigger, in this case, the master's thesis, that was leading me to feel particular emotions and act in certain ways. But what the cognitive behavioral model puts forward is this, is that we have this trigger, we have this situation in the environment, and we attach meaning to it, or we have thoughts and beliefs. And it's those two combined that lead us to feel certain ways and act certain ways. Okay. So it gets even more interesting when we consider that we've got different levels of thought or belief. Think of this as kind of different types of thought, or different layers on an onion. I'm just going to talk about two different types of thought that we have, or different levels of thought. So the first level is what's called an automatic thought. So an automatic thought is really, it's when your mind's on autopilot. It's just what's going through your mind at any given moment. It's like a stream of consciousness that's kind of describing a situation or how things are, or how things should be. So for example, when I was sitting down to work every day on my master's thesis, the automatic thought, I suppose that thought autopilot was like, ugh, I don't want to do this, you know. Sometimes people say to me, you know, I don't have a stream of consciousness. I don't have a voice kind of describing the situation. And I tell them the voice that's telling you that you don't have a stream of consciousness, that's the voice I'm talking about, okay? So we can get at the kind of next level of thought I want to talk about by asking questions, you know, but by taking this automatic thought, by taking this stream of consciousness, or by taking what's in our head and asking questions like why, or because, or why does that matter? And what we start to get at then are what are called underlying beliefs. And an underlying belief, it's like a rule or an attitude or an assumption about ourselves or about other people or about the world more generally that lead to these behaviors and these emotions. So for example, you know, when I was sitting down to work on my master's thesis, I was having the automatic thought, oh, I don't want to do this. And when I looked at why, or when I looked at what the because was, it was like, you know, I don't want to do this because it's hard and it shouldn't be so hard. What we're starting to get at there is an underlying belief or a story or a narrative that we tell ourselves in these situations that lead us to feel certain ways and to behave in certain ways. Okay. So it turns out that there is some very common narratives around our behavior more generally, but also around our productivity. And these narratives are related to kind of four key areas. So we tend to tell ourselves stories or narratives around our desire to do the task, our ability to do the task, our reasons for maybe not doing the task or doing the task, and our needs, or what it needs to be like in the situation. So for example, around our desire, we might tell ourselves, oh, I don't feel like doing it, or I don't want to because it's hard, or because it's difficult, or because it's boring, or I shouldn't feel this way is another kind of common desire or narrative. And so these are all about why we want, or in this case, don't want to do the task. We also tell ourselves narratives around our ability to do the task. So for example, common ones might be, you know, if I try this, I might fail, or it's not going to work, or I'm not able to because I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, I don't have the resources of some description. We also tell ourselves maybe things like, you know what, I should be able to do this. And this use of I should can also lead to a lot of guilt and kind of shame, because, you know, it's something we feel we should be able to do. We also list reasons why we shouldn't do a task. So, for example, a very common one is, if I fail, others won't like or respect me. And so I shouldn't try and do it, because at least if I don't try, then I can't fail. And if I can't fail, well, then I won't feel embarrassed. Another common reason is that I shouldn't have to, you know, that I suppose the world should be different and I shouldn't have to be doing it like this. Or another one more generally is, you know, it shouldn't be this way. It shouldn't be so difficult. It shouldn't be so hard. And finally, we've got narratives around our needs. I think a very common one is, it needs to be perfect, or the situation needs to be perfect. And then an extension of that is, if I'm not perfect, or if it's not perfect, then I'm a failure. And another common need narrative we have is that I need to feel motivated and confident. And it's these narratives, you know, these narratives about our desire, ability, reason, and need that lead to us feeling particular ways, and then as a result, maybe not being as productive as we'd like to be. Okay. So I'm going to do a little exercise, I suppose, just to break this up a little bit. And this is about kind of creating some awareness around these emotions that we're feeling and our productivity and the narratives or stories that we're telling ourselves. So grab that pen and a piece of paper I'd ask you to grab. And then what I want you to do is, I want you to draw a triangle. So I'll show you up here on my little board. I'm not sure, it depends how big I am on your screen, but if you follow the slides, it should be enough as well. But I just want you to draw a triangle, something like that, kind of maybe about half the side of the page. And on the bottom left-hand corner, I want you to write the word emotions. In the bottom right-hand corner, I want you to write the word behavior. And in the top of the triangle, I want you to write the words thoughts or beliefs. And we're going to try to put our finger on some of them that might be happening for you. So what I want you to do is, I want you to pick a specific situation recently where you were trying to be productive, maybe you weren't being productive, and you were feeling a negative emotion as a result. Yeah. So I'll use an example on my own experience recently. Is I was trying to finish the slides for a major presentation. Don't worry, it wasn't this one. And I was going through a bad time trying to do it. So just let me know in the chat box. I just want to make sure people are following me here. So try and pick a recent time, a specific example of when you were trying to be productive and you were feeling a negative emotion. Okay, so just let me know in the chat box if you get my meaning. Just give me a yes. Awesome. Okay, cool. Okay, thanks so much, guys. Okay, so in the middle of the triangle, I want you to write what that situation was. So in my instance, that's just, you know, finishing the slides for presentation X. I'm going to think of that as a trigger or the situation. Yeah. The next thing I want you to do is, I want you to just take a little bit of time, and I want you to imagine that situation. Maybe close your eyes if you haven't got your camera on or whatever. And I want you to try and put your finger on the emotion that you were feeling. So in my instance, I was under a bit of pressure for this presentation, and for one reason or another, I'd felt I hadn't enough time to prepare. And so I was feeling a little bit anxious and a little bit frustrated by the whole thing. And it wasn't going well, and I wasn't seeming to be able to be very productive on it. So what I want you to do is just try and imagine what you were feeling in that instance. Sometimes if you close your eyes and visualize the situation, it can help. But maybe it was a little bit of anger or frustration because you weren't making progress, you weren't moving forward. Maybe it was a bit of guilt or shame because you feel you should be able to do it, or you should have worked harder. Or maybe it's a little bit of fear or anxiety because you were worried that that whatever you're working on isn't going to work out, maybe. Maybe it's boredom because it's a very boring task or something that you're really struggling to kind of work through. Or maybe it's sadness because you are, I suppose, upset that you're not getting done what you need to get done. Okay, so just let me know in the chat box. Take a second and see if you've managed to put your finger on that emotion. Just let me know in the chat box when you've managed to do it. Awesome. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Alison. Thanks, Cornelia. Cheers. Okay, cool. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Okay, so someone wrote in that they were feeling unsure of direction. And I suppose I would almost argue that that's more of a thought than an emotion. I think feeling unsure might be emotion. But if I think I'll get to the thought bit in a minute. Okay. So the next thing I want you to do, I want you to imagine that situation again. And I want you to put your finger on what you were actually doing when you were feeling that emotion. What was your behavior? So we're going to put that in the bottom right hand of the triangle. So in my instance, what I was actually doing is I was worrying. I was imagining the things that could go wrong. I was pointing out all the things that were wrong with the presentation, and I was worrying rather than actually working to fix it and to make it how I wanted it to be. Other common behaviors we often do when we're being unproductive, we give out. We kind of give out about the situation and how difficult it is. And maybe the most common one is we tend to procrastinate, or we avoid the task somehow. This can be a range of behaviors. We can procrastinate in lots of different ways. But generally, I suppose a sign that we're procrastinating is we're doing another task and not doing anything at all. So, for example, I might get stuck in or go to YouTube quite a lot, or I tend to clean when I procrastinate as well. So just try to put your finger on the behavior, and again, just let me know in the chat box what you're actually doing. Thanks, I Santos. Thanks very much. Procrastination. Okay. Okay, a lot of procrastination. And I suppose we can procrastinate in millions of ways. Worrying and understanding, avoiding, giving up, avoid. Okay, cool. So I suppose a point with part of the reason I ask guys to put stuff in the chat box is just to make the point that we all do this all the time. It's completely normal and completely, and I think it's good as well to see that a lot of people struggle with it. Okay, so the next bit we're going to do, and this is a bit more abstract, and it's we're going to try and put our finger on the thought or narrative that we're telling ourselves in the situation. So, for example, when I thought about it and I went, okay, what I want you to do is close your eyes and imagine. And I want you to try and imagine what was going through your head. Yeah. So in my instance, I was saying things like, this is a pain in the arse. It's not good enough. Why can't I do this? And like I work on these things all the time. So again, just to make the point that we all do these all the time. But once you've kind of put your finger on what the automatic thought was, what the top layer has, I want you to try and get at what was the underlying belief. So what was the narrative or the story that you were telling yourself in the situation that was leading to the emotion or behavior? So for example, when I was saying things like, this is a pain in the arse, I suppose this was a desire narrative. What I was really saying is, I don't want to be doing this, When I was saying it's not good enough, what I was really saying underneath it was, I might fail, or I might not be able to do this. And when I was asking myself the question, why can't I do this? I suppose what was underlying that was, I might not be able to do this. So a good way of doing it sometimes is if you take that first, what's going through your head, and you ask yourself, because, so this is a pain in the arse because I don't want to do it. It's not good enough because I might fail, or I might not be able to do this because, it's been very tricky in the past to do it. Okay. Okay, so just let me know. Okay, very good. You guys are getting a lot of awesome narratives. Thanks for sharing. Awesome. Okay, cool. And it's true, thinking about other things. Awesome. And so these narratives will often be around your desire to do the task, whether you want to do it or not, your ability, am I able, or what reasons should or shouldn't I have to be doing it, or what do I need in the situation? Okay, cool. Okay. So hopefully that helped to kind of create some awareness. Just let me know in the chat box how you found that, whether it was enlightening at all. Okay, cool. Okay. So I suppose once we've kind of started to identify these narratives and identify the stories we're telling ourselves that are leading us to feel things, what do we start to do about it? Well, what do we do when we're doubting our ability, or we don't feel like doing something, or we're focusing on the reason? Well, the first point to make is, even if we can identify these narratives, we can't just tell ourselves what to think. It doesn't tend to work because it tends to be a little bit inauthentic. So, for example, if we're not feeling confident about something or confident about our ability, just telling ourselves that we're able to do it probably isn't going to work because we're not really going to believe ourselves. So what do we do about it? Well, the method I normally use when I'm working one-to-one with clients is a method called Socratic questioning. And Socratic questioning is it's just a disciplined form. It's just a series of questions. You can Google these, you can get them online, no problem, that allow us to kind of investigate, I suppose, our thoughts and beliefs, so we can explore them and we can figure out, I suppose, the idea with them really, it's all about creating thoughts that are maybe a little bit more realistic or more helpful. So really what these 10 questions boil down to is this, is that, is the thought a realistic thought? Is it 100% realistic? And if it's not 100% realistic, what might be a more realistic thought in the situation? And secondly, sometimes our thoughts can be very, very realistic, but often they're not helpful. So the second question to kind of ask yourself around these beliefs is it a helpful thought? And what might be a more helpful thought in the situation? And by helpful, I mean, is it helping you move forward? Is it serving you? Is it helping you move towards your goals? Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to, I suppose, for the rest of the talk, focus on some of these common areas that we tend to have narratives in, like desire, ability, reason, and need. And I suppose have a look at how we can kind of start to create maybe slightly different narratives and stories that are going to help us be a little bit more productive. So the first type of narrative I'd like to explore are what are called ability narratives. This is when we tell ourselves stories about our ability to do the task. So for example, we might tell ourselves, it'll be really hard, or I might fail, or I should be able to do this, or I can't do it because. And so if that was the narrative in that little exercise that I was doing, what I'd say to you is a very good question to ask yourself in this instance is, how have I dealt with similar challenges in the past? So when I've been trying to do something similar, and I succeeded, one, what strategies did I use? What worked? Yeah. How was I? What was I doing that was different than now that I'm finding it difficult? And if you did something similar in the past, but maybe it didn't work out so well, a very good question to ask yourself then is, well, what did I learn and what can I do differently? Yeah. So I like this question for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of starts to give us a good indication of, are we capable of doing what we're doing now? And two, it starts to give us some very active things that we can do about it. In terms of doubting our ability, a very helpful, I suppose, set of beliefs I really like they're outlined in the book Mindset by Carol Dweck. Highly recommend this book. It's very, very good. And in the book, she talks about two types of mindset. One is a fixed mindset, and the second one is a growth mindset. And it's very good. It's a very good concept to kind of get your head around when you're doubting your ability and feeling negative emotions around being able to do something. So the first mindset she talks about in the book is a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is this idea that our abilities are fixed. You're either good at something or you're bad at something. And that if you have to try at something, if you have to apply effort, then you're just not really good at that thing. And so you should probably just leave it alone. And it sees setbacks. It sees when we find things as difficult as a bad thing, means you lack something, means you don't have the intelligence, for example, or you don't have the natural ability to do it. And so when we experience setbacks and we have this fixed mindset, we tend to think I failed, and we can get quite self-judgmental. In contrast to that, I highly recommend this book for this, is the idea of a growth mindset. And the idea of a growth mindset is that, well, we can change, we can grow, we can develop our abilities by application, by trying things and learning new skills and by putting effort in. And so that means that, if you're being challenged, if you're finding things difficult and you're having to put effort in it, it's a good thing because you're actually growing, you're actually becoming, I suppose, a more effective human being. And as a result, you should expect setbacks, because if you're not getting setbacks, then you're probably not growing as much as you could. And so someone who's got this growth mindset then embraces challenge and doesn't mind when things are difficult. People who've got this mindset also tend to learn better, and put in more motivated, to put in more effort, they tend to problem solve better, and they tend to get better results as a result. And so they see setbacks as not so much, I failed, this isn't good. They tend to ask themselves the question, how can I improve? So I suppose in a nutshell, really, the fixed mindset is the idea that, I can't do it. And the growth mindset is I can't do it yet. Yeah. Pat DeVilly has a version of this as well. He likes this. So rather than doing something, we don't fail, we either succeed or we learn, which I really like. Okay. So the next set of narratives are desire narratives. So what do we do when we're not being productive and we're using a desire narrative, or we're telling ourselves a story around our desire to do the task? So for example, we might tell ourselves, oh, I don't feel like doing it, or I need to feel motivated or confident to do it, or I don't want it because it's difficult or it's hard, or I don't want it because it's boring. What do we do in that instance? Well, the first kind of question when I'm working with people often is, if you don't feel like doing something, is it a more general that you're not feeling motivated? And often the basis of that can be if maybe your physical or your psychological needs aren't being met. So for example, are you working crazy long hours? Are you getting enough sleep? Are you tired? Do you have a health issue? Or, is your diet a bit off that maybe you're not, maybe you've got too much sugar in your diet and that's really affecting your energy levels, or you drink too much coffee and it's leading you to feel anxious. And so as a result, you're not getting done what you need to get done. Another common one in terms of your physical needs is, are you exercising? We need to be moving for about 20 minutes a day, some form of cardio in order to function properly, really. Or are you taking care of your stress? Because that can have really negatively affect your energy levels. So are you using relaxation technique pretty much every day, or are you taking enough downtime? Are you taking at least a day a week off and an hour every day to chill out? More, if your psychological needs aren't being met, that can really affect your overall motivation as well. So for example, do you have a sense of safety and security? Are you secure in your job? Do you feel comfortable at where you live? Do you have a sense of belonging and connection? Do you have positive relationships in your life? Do you have fun in your life? Do you have freedom in your life? And these are all things that, because of COVID, I think have obviously had some really negative impacts on that. But if these things aren't right, we're not going to feel generally motivated. It's difficult to be productive when we're unhappy. A second question, and I suppose these more relate to saying narratives, or when we tell ourselves that we don't want to do it because of reason X, Y, or Z, or because it's boring, is what's really important here. I think it's a very important question to ask. And how can you move towards what's important and what needs to happen? So the reason for that is, the reason I ask those questions around, what's really important here, is that it changes our focus from what it is that we want to avoid, or what's called a negatively phrased goal, to what it is that we want, or what's called a positively phrased goal. And the reason I do that is that positively phrased goals have very important positive effects on our emotions, on our motivation, and our ability to think and problem solve and think creatively. So when we phrase our goals negatively, we state them around what it is we want to avoid. So for example, I don't want to feel this way, or I want to stop procrastinating, for example. And the issue with this is it creates a lot of negative emotion. And it creates negative emotion because you're focused on the problem, you're focused on what it is you want to avoid, but it's also negatively phrased goals are unachievable. So for example, if you say I want to stop procrastinating, you can never actually hit that target because you've always got the potential to procrastinate. So with all this negative emotion that's being generated, the threat systems in your brain kick in, the amygdala, you might have heard of it. Basically what happens is the fight or flight response. So the fight or flight response is a physiological kind of, we feel stressed. But one of the other effects of that is it tends to narrow our focus. It changes how we think. We zoom in on the problem, and as a result, we can't see the bigger picture and also possible solutions. So it really negatively affects our ability to creatively problem solve. Conversely, when we phrase our goals positively, and we phrase our goals around what it is that we want, so what it is we want to achieve, what it is we want to learn, what's important, and how can we create that? This is the main source of positive emotion we have in our lives. So the main source of positive emotion we have in our lives is when we're making progress towards a goal that we think is important. I mean, you think about it. So for example, I'll show you an example with the slides in a minute. But I suppose the idea is that as we move towards something, we start to get a sense of progress and it feels good. So what happens here is the reward centers of our brain are kicked in, especially a particular area called the reticular formation. And all the reticular formation does is that we figure out where it is that we want to go. We figure out where it is that we are. And our brain literally starts to brainstorm and fill in the gaps. So very, very important. And it also feels a lot better. So for example, when I was finishing these slides on a major presentation and I was really struggling with it, I changed my focus and started asking myself this question: what's important? What do we need to do? How can I make it better? How can I make it simpler? How can I get that point across? And what this leads to then is, I suppose, taking action behaviors in order to start to reach those goals. So I was brainstorming ideas, I was experimenting, I was practicing. And as a result, then we start to feel all those wonderful positive emotions. So like motivation and optimism and curiosity and satisfaction and joy, because we're moving towards that goal. So flip that from like, rather than focusing on what it is we want to avoid, what is it we want to achieve, and we can start to break that down. Okay, the next type of narrative I'd like to talk a little bit about is reason narratives. And this is when we give ourselves reasons why we shouldn't do the task. Obviously, there can be a lot of these, but in terms of our time, I'm just going to focus on one. And look, a common reason narrative for not trying something or not being productive is that if I try, I might fail. And if I fail, others won't like or respect me. Yeah, and so we're worried about being embarrassed or being judged. And so a question I like to ask people when they come to me with that narrative is this. Is what I want you to do is imagine a good friend or close family member in the exact same situation. And what advice would you give them? And this is a really good question, I think, for two reasons. One, it gives us a little bit of emotional distance because we tend to, I suppose, think more logically when we think about other people. And we also tend to be a bit kinder and nicer to those that we love than we are to ourselves. So we're a little bit less judgmental. And so, for example, when I applied this about that presentation I was trying to get done, and I suppose I was worried partly because if it was a big presentation in front of a lot of people, and I was worried it wasn't going to go well and that people would judge me and think I was a bad speaker, I asked myself that question, what would I say to a friend in the same position? And they'd be like, well, I think a common one we often get for this is that others might actually respect you for trying and understand that it is difficult to get up and speak in front of a lot of people. And that if it doesn't go amazingly perfectly, well, then it's still quite an achievement, you know? Okay, so the final type of narrative I want to talk about are about our needs. And I suppose often we feel negative emotion when we're trying to be productive because we tell ourselves about how things need to be or how I need to be. In one particular narrative, I think it'd be particularly destructive around this is perfectionism. So perfectionism is based around a belief or thought that, first of all, it needs to be perfect. And secondly, if it's not perfect, well, then I'm a failure or I've failed. It's often very much linked to very unrealistic or high expectations. So for example, if that's someone who gets 90% in an exam and is very upset that they didn't get to 10%, you know, that they didn't get 100%. Similarly, that people who are perfectionists tend to ignore what's right and focus on what's wrong. So that person will be obsessed with the 10% and would forget to celebrate the fact that they got 90% of an exam right. It's very much linked to black or white thinking or all or nothing thinking. So it's either absolutely perfect or it's useless, you know. It's often linked to too much, where we use the words should or must too much, you know. It needs to be like that, it should be like that, it has to be like that. And we also tend to label ourselves as a result. So, you know, if it's not 100% perfect, well, then we kind of internalize that and go, well, then I'm a bit of a failure. This in turn means perfectionism is linked to a lot of guilt and shame. So what do we do about it? Well, again, I suppose I'll go back to those two questions, and we need to ask ourselves, you know, when we're being perfectionist about stuff, is it a realistic stance? You know, does it need to be perfect? And if it's perfect, am I a failure? And I suppose a question maybe to ask yourself in that instance is your self-worth equal to your achievements? Or another way of thinking about that is to think about someone close to you that you love and ask that, you know, do you love them because of what they've achieved or because of the person that they are, for example? A second important question to ask when we're being perfectionists is it helpful? Is it actually helping us move towards our overall goals? Because often we spend too much time perfecting little bits and pieces of tasks that we don't really need to do. So I think a good question to ask ourselves in that instance is actually, what's good enough? Another question I find very useful when I'm being perfectionist as well is this. And again, this is one that can give us a kind of different perspective on the situation, give us a bit of emotional distance, is to ask yourself, will it matter in 10 days? Will it matter in 10 months? Or will it matter in 10 years? When I thought about that presentation, I was like, will it matter in 10 days? I was like, well, most people who were at it won't probably remember a whole lot of it. In 10 months, absolutely nobody is going to remember anything about the details of the presentation. But they might remember me because they remember I spoke at an event. And in 10 years, I probably won't remember the bloody presentation. So I think it's a very good question to give you a bit of emotional distance from things. Okay, so just to wrap up, so we spoke about the cognitive behavioral model and how our, around any given situation, we've got emotions and thoughts and behaviors, and these all interact. And a very important, I suppose, relationship is that our beliefs or our thoughts or the narrative that we tell ourselves in a story can really affect how we behave and how we feel. And we talked about four kind of particular narratives that we have. We have narratives around our desire, do I want to do the task? We have narratives around our ability. Am I able to do the task? We have narratives around our reasons for doing the task. And we have narratives around our needs. And so what I'm suggesting is maybe rather than telling ourselves I'm not able, maybe we can ask ourselves the question, what did I do in the past that I was successful? Or maybe tell ourselves that, I'm not able yet. Or rather than saying I don't want to, maybe we ask ourselves the questions, what's important and how can I make that happen? Or rather than saying it has to be perfect, we can ask ourselves what's good enough. Okay, so just to wrap up, just before I hand you back to the girls, just to let you know, just to remind you, I do that free consultation. If you'd like to hear more talks like this, join the meetup. And again, the details of the Procrastination Bootcamp, there should be a link in the chat there for you. I'll stick in another one now while Christina is chatting, and hang out for the Q&A. We'd love to hear you.